Hi everybody, and welcome to another lecture here today. On this lecture, we're going to be taking a look at our second short story out of Winesburg, Ohio by Sherwood Anderson. And the story that we're looking at here today is entitled The Strength of God. And I think we'll jump right into it. I've prepared some lecture notes here. So we'll probably read some parts from the actual story, and then other parts we can just kind of gloss over a little bit, because I've got these notes here, and it'll help us to cover those parts. So I think we need to start here by doing a little bit of background on the Presbyterian Church, and Reverend Curtis Hartman is a reverend of the Presbyterian Church. And just to give you a little bit of background on this sect of Christianity. This is a more or less reformed and progressive sect of Christianity. So when I was looking up some background here based on the context of the character Reverend Hartman, his attraction to Kate Swift here, the woman that he likes to kind of peep and see through the window from the church bell tower. One of my interests was looking up their beliefs, their kinds of ideas on sexuality, and whether or not it is seen as kind of a sin within the faith, or because of the Reformed and progressive movement, if there's kind of a different idea there. So I'll just share some of the information that I found. So instead of the church looking upon adultery and fornication, which you could say Hartman is on his way to being guilty of both, right? It does mention that he is married here. So to have these excessive thoughts toward another woman, obviously we're headed in the direction of adultery if they were ever to be capitalized on. Now we know that they're not, but we're still kind of, as far as he's concerned, it could be moving in that direction. And then there's fornication, right? Sexual activity, again, of a kind of excessive nature, right? And again, he's moving in that particular direction as he has this kind of desire and this lust toward this woman, and kind of more or less spies on her as well. So back to what it says. Instead of the church looking upon adultery and fornication as sin, as something to be condemned and judged, instead, according to Presbyterian belief, we are offered the compassion of Christ. However, a confession and a repentance are required. So the compassion of Christ is there. However, almost as a prerequisite, there must be a confession and a repentance, right? And you could ask yourself, when we think about Reverend Hartman, at some point in this story, does he confess? We can look for evidence of that. Is there an actual repentance for him as well, right? Does he repent? Again, something we can be on the lookout for. So there is room for Christ's compassion as far as these sins of adultery and fornication, right? Yes, in some ways there's sin, but the compassion of Christ is there. But in order to have room for Christ's compassion, we must remember he has made it a sin to engage in sexual activities outside the marriage bond, right? So we have to kind of go back to adultery is a sin. Excessively, it's looked at as lechery, in the sense that you are seeking you are seeking sexual indulgence beyond what is needed in just your marriage. So it's this idea of excess and greed and lust, right? And lechery and lasciviousness, right? So we have to remember that according to Presbyterian belief, adultery is a sin. This is not a new morality, but rather a washing away and a sanctifying of sin. And no sexual act between persons competent to give mutual consent should be prohibited. I don't know if that particular idea really plugs into what we need for this short story, but according to Presbyterian belief as put forth by a prominent Presbyterian kind of philosopher and thinker, religious philosopher, religious thinker, Dr. Fletcher, and I looked this information up, again, no sexual act between persons who are competent enough to do that together should be prohibited, right? So they don't prohibit sex as long as the people are competent enough to have this sexual act together. As a side note, Dr. Fletcher was also in the communist Red Scares of the 1950s, the Red Scare, the communist kind of witch hunts that occurred in this country. Dr. Fletcher was accused of being a Marxist, and I think the idea was he was quite a Marxist, so he had an interesting kind of social, political agenda, right? Let's get into the story, right? Right away on page 87, it is mentioned that Reverend Curtis Hartman, his complacency is a particular philosophy in itself, right? And as a reverend, as a seemingly high church official, complacency you can see is kind of a problem. The whole idea is if you have this religious authority, you should be, in other words, on top of your game, right? You should be aggressive or at least quite lucid to the world of sin around you, to people's behaviors, and you really should be promoting and encouraging a religiously oriented style of living. But here, he is not a huge advocate any longer because he is complacent. And what does complacent means? It means you kind of just accept things as they are. So I guess we could say if people are not following their religious norms as much as they should, if you're complacent, you're just going to say, well, there's not much I can do about this, right? Complacency. And it is mentioned early on that complacency is his kind of philosophy early on here. Why would someone have this attitude? Is this simply giving up on orthodoxy and making sure that people adhere to the faith? Maybe he has kind of given up in some respects. And why would you give up? Why would you become complacent? Just to get a couple ideas out there, at least one idea. It could be that society is changing so much that there's not much, and people therefore are changing. Social norms are changing. Popular culture is always at odds with a kind of religious culture, and maybe popular culture is winning, right? Is overpowering religious culture. If all this is happening, maybe you just kind of stand back off because there's not much you can do and you grow complacent, right? He early on momentarily gives into desire, and the language is he notices the bare shoulders and white throat of a woman. Now, in our hypersexualized culture nowadays, that might not be seen as something erotic and sensual and alluring and desirable, but for a reverend and for the time period that this is being written, bare shoulders and this white throat could meet those specifications or those requirements. One thing is the shoulders usually have to be covered in some kind of Orthodox religious, from an Orthodox religious perspective. I know when I went to the Vatican years ago, I remember seeing a girl who was all by herself. It was super early morning. We got a really early start, me and this guy that I had met that I was traveling with. And there was a girl when we got to the Vatican outside, and she just had a nice little dress on, but her shoulders were exposed. And they don't let you into the Vatican. They don't let you into St. Peter's, and the Basilica and all these things. They don't let you in there if you are exposing as a woman your bare shoulders, because it's seen as kind of a distraction and obviously I guess you could say a disrespect to God, right? And everything that's kind of there. White throat, pure, perhaps, when we think of this word white, untouched, maybe virgin, right? This idea of virginity, that could be the idea here too. Now we know we're looking at Kate Swift, who is the town school teacher. I think the follow-up story is called The Teacher. And that's where Anderson focuses on Kate Swift and her desires and her perspective. In all honesty, it's kind of like a companion story to The Strength of God, because it picks up, and now we're moving forward with Kate Swift. I won't be doing a lecture on that, but that's a story that you might find some interest in, especially as you know you have to eventually write a paper on one of these stories. Who knows, that could be it. Hartman's experience with women is somewhat limited. He is married, but that courtship that he has with his wife was, as is mentioned in the story, very formal and this kind of prolonged courtship. There's a contrast brewing here. His feelings for Kate Swift, a woman he doesn't even know, is really based on a kind of instinctual and kind of sexual level, right? He just sees her and he has this attraction, and of course he feels guilty about it. But that is in contrast to the relationship he has with his wife, which is kind of sterile, very kind of managed and arranged, and it was this very formal courtship, right? Again, contrasted with this feeling he has for Kate Swift as he spies on her through her window at night is a very informal kind of connection, right? Okay, very good. I think he sees his marriage, as many people maybe do, as kind of a duty, more as a charismatic relationship that he's really passionate about and has this kind of vibrancy about. So with his wife, it's more of a formality, and it's more of a duty that he has. You could make connections to this idea that we also have a duty to God as well. I think when you go back to like early Puritan thought, right, and Puritanism is by and large one of the earlier sects that this nation was built on, Christian sects, S-E-C-T-S. We're talking about sects of Christianity, this splintering of Christianity into multiple, really probably hundreds upon hundreds of different sects. In Puritanism, as far as I understand, the most important marriage you had was not to your wife or your husband. That was secondary. The primary marriage was to God, right? So you had this duty to God, which you could argue is very similar to this duty to your wife or husband as well. Now, we get to page 88. There's some wonderful symbolism taking place in this story, and the obvious symbolism that you have to kind of be mindful of throughout the entire story and really figure out how it's being dealt with is the glass work in the church bell tower of Christ, basically kind of offering help or offering some kind of guidance, or at least his presence, to this young boy who I believe is kneeling, right, staring up raptly at Christ. In fact, maybe I will very quickly just read the language for you so we have it. So on the bottom of 88, toward the bottom, I'll just read this paragraph. The minister almost wept with joy at this deliverance from the carnal desire to peep, and went back to his own house praising God. In an ill moment he forgot, however, to stop the hole in the window. The piece of glass broken out at the corner of the window just nipped off the bare heel of the boy, standing motionless and looking with rapt eyes into the face of Christ. So just so we understand the imagery here, there is this church window, and it's like one of those colorful kind of, wish I knew, the stained glass windows, right? Stained glass window, and there's Christ, there's this boy, but there's a piece of glass that is broken, and that piece of glass is broken out at the corner of the window, basically where the bare heel of the boy is, right? So right on the heel of the boy, if you could get this visual, that's where the glass is broken out. And through that glass is where Reverend Hartman can see out his window all the way across the way and into the bedroom window of Kate Swift. And he has been feeling guilty because he has this desire to watch her at night, and he's almost anticipating this, and he can't stop himself. Now, when we talk about the bare heel, what you have to be what you have to connect that to is the Achilles heel, right? And what is an Achilles heel? I think this goes back to some kind of Greek mythology, but it is an idea that sticks with us. It's a weak spot. It's a vulnerable point. If I can kind of explain the symbolism for you very quickly, just so you clearly understand it. So here we have the Achilles heel is where the glass is broken out, and we're talking about a weak spot, a point of vulnerability. So what is it for Reverend Hartman? It's this desire, right? His weak point, his point of vulnerability is this desire to look out of this broken glass and into the window of Kate Swift, where he can't control this temptation, he can't control this desire, right? So that we can see very early on is his vulnerability. It's his internal conflict, and we know that this plagues him quite a bit. Now, there's some weird stuff taking place here as far as his feelings toward Kate. He's almost a hypocrite in some ways, because we understand and he understands that he can't control this urge to peep in on this woman. His instincts and his passions are getting the better of him, and he just wants to watch this woman, right? But at the same time, almost hypocritically, he says, this woman needs to be aware of her sin. And you might ask yourself, well, what's the sin he's talking about here? For him, every time he sees her, she's reading a book. And that for him is sinful. And how could reading a book or novel be considered a sin? That would be a question I would ask of you. But I want to plug in some questions here, or plug in some responses. How could reading a book or a novel be considered a sin? Well, it's not the Bible, so that might be the biggest answer of all, right? Why are you reading anything if it's not the Bible or something that is, or I think there's a couple books that are very important to the Presbyterian faith. I think one is called like the Book of Order, and the other one is called the Book of Confessions. So there's two books, correct me if I'm wrong, that are super important for the Presbyterian faith. But to get to some more general reasoning, it's indulgence, right? Whenever you read something that is from an Orthodox Christian standpoint, for the most part, whenever you read or play a video game or watch a movie or even watch sports or any of these things that we consider kind of for leisure and entertainment, one way of looking at it from a strict perspective is that's indulgence. You don't need it. You're indulging in something, right? Same thing with pornography, right? Which obviously is very popular these days. If you read these books, if you take part in these things, it's an untamed curiosity, right? There's something of an untamed nature about it. It's obviously a distraction from God, and it goes without saying that the possible content of whatever it is you're reading or watching or the video game you're playing or whatever it is might be questionable as far as a strict religious perspective is concerned. And again, I think that's easy to see when we talk about popular culture headbutting constantly up against religious culture. You can see there's a lot of conflict there, right? Because there's a lot of questionable material that we engage with as far as popular culture is concerned. So that for Hartman is her sin, that she's reading this book, and it could be something that is problematic for the reasons I just mentioned. But let's keep in mind his hypocrisy. He's the one peeping in on her window, right? And I'm not sure he senses that that's a bigger problem than her reading a book here, but we can come back to that. Because of this urge to peep in on Kate and the guilt that is coming with that, right? He cannot really go about his job any longer. It's kind of breaking his routine at the church. It's a break in concentration, right? Page 90, he feels as if he can overcome his flaw, his vulnerability, which we've talked about, perhaps through some strength of God. Therefore, he wants to challenge himself. He wants to put this strength of God to the test, and he does not fix the window, right? The easy thing for him to do would be to block out that hole in the window, so he is preventing himself as far as kind of putting up some obstacle, some barrier in between him and this urge from looking in on Kate, right? From following through with this urge and this desire to see her. But he wants to test himself. He wants to challenge himself, so he actually keeps that hole open and sees if he can manage that way. He wants to essentially keep the temptation alive, which is interesting, right? You keep the temptation alive. Don't like cancel it out or block it out or deal with it in some kind of way that your will and your own mentality is not being tested and challenged every step of the way. Keep the temptation alive, keep the hole there, right? Keep it there. And this makes good sense, I think, on a very general level, because in this world, in our society, temptation is everywhere, and you can't really shelter yourself off from it, right? How would you shelter yourself off from temptation in our particular society? Sure, some people do, but I think I'm talking about your average individual here. How in the world would you be able to shelter yourself off from a world or a society filled with temptation? You literally, perhaps literally, would have to lock yourself indoors, totally take that TV off the wall, box it, put it away, and it would be a difficult life and a severely kind of changed life. Instead, it's all about changing this up here, right? That you actually have to live with these temptations, but you have to have, maybe through this strength of God, as Reverend Hartman is concerned, you have to manage and kind of temper these urges and these desires, right? So he wants to keep it there. I'll just read something on page 90. This is about halfway down, and I think we see a little bit of a surrender here. I want to look at the woman and to think of kissing her shoulders, and I'm going to let myself think what I choose, he declared bitterly. And tears came into his eyes. There's obviously, it's kind of paradoxical, it's contradictory, it's ironic that he's saying, I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to think these thoughts. I want to kiss this woman's shoulders. But then, of course, he says it bitterly, and tears come into his eyes. So by admitting to this, it's bringing a lot of heartache to him. He began to think that he would get out of the ministry and try some other way of life. I shall go to some city and get into business, he declared. If my nature is such that I cannot resist sin, I shall give myself over to sin. He equates a couple other things with sin there. He basically says, if I realize that I want to kiss this woman's shoulders and there's no stopping these thoughts, I might as well move to a city. I think Sherwood Anderson is mentioning here, the commentary is, cities are places of sin, right? You move to a city, we were just talking about temptation, it's going to be everywhere, right? So that's what Hartman is thinking here. I'll just move to a city and I'll give in to sin completely. And then he also says, and I love this, and I'll get into business. Basically providing us with the social commentary. If I'm going to just become this sinful person, then I might as well get into business, because business is full of sin. And you might be asking yourself, especially some of the business majors out there, well, why is business sin? And I think, we're not saying that all business is sin here, but there is an element of business which is you're taking advantage of people. If you look at advertising on TV, by and large, it takes advantage of people's vulnerabilities, right? Look at car salesmen. Look at the kind of experiences we have sometimes when we go to the dentist or the doctor, and we find ourselves second-guessing their judgments because we feel like they are used car salesmen and they just want to take advantage of us. We don't need the procedure, but hey, doctor needs a new Cadillac. So I think he's providing us with some social commentary about business and the fact that by and large, it is built upon greed and excess and taking advantage of people, etc., right? Something to think about. Steinbeck says the same thing in Grapes of Wrath. There's a wonderful section in that book where he says, you know, business people think they're so kind and charitable and so smart, and then he's pretty scathing about it, you know, but really, Steinbeck mentions they're idiots. They think they're charitable and nice, but really they take advantage of people, and they've got it all twisted, right? They've got it all twisted. So if I'm going to give myself into this world of sin, I might as well put myself in the deep end entirely, thinks Reverend Hartman there on page 90. Moving on the bottom of page 90, he actually mentions the Greeks. And I'll just read it, bottom of 90, man has a right to expect living passion and beauty in a woman. Man should expect passion and beauty in a woman and should appreciate it and should desire it. He has no right to forget that he is an animal, and in me there is something that is Greek. I've talked about this in previous lectures. I think it was with Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. But from the Greeks we get the Hellenistic culture, right? Hellenism. Hellenism is a focus and admiration on the human body and the beauty that it has, and therefore the desire that is the outcome of the human body is nothing that we should feel bad about. Contrasted with the Hebraistic culture, which we by and large see in the Middle East and perhaps some other parts of the world as well, which is the body should be covered, right? Especially for women. The body should be covered, and we have to be careful about the desire that we accentuate with the body, right? We want to make sure we're not creating desire from the body here, because of course that opposes God. Here he's saying, I might as well just be this Greek Hellenistic person and be done with it. I will throw off the woman, of my bosom and seek other woman. That's an interesting line. Basically he's saying is after I have this woman and have my way with her and express my desire for this woman, I'll throw her off me and seek other woman. So it will not stop. Talk about adultery. You know, that kind of goes along with that idea, right? One woman is not enough. I must experience the beauty and act upon my desires with every woman, right? This is a pretty low point as far as Reverend Hartman is concerned, because again we have to remember he's a reverend, right? To have these kinds of thoughts, this is a big conflict for him. Maybe you could even say this is about as bad as he gets. I will besiege this school teacher. Besiege is such an aggressive word with connotations of conquest, but that's what he's saying. I will take this school teacher, right? I will fly in the face of all men, and if I am a creature of carnal lusts, I will live then for my lusts. Which of course is debatable. Some people feel that's the way life should be led, right? But obviously from a more or less religious standpoint, this is dangerous territory, okay? Okay. On page 91, he has a near-death experience. We know that he runs out of his home barefoot. I believe it's like in the snow. And so obviously he's on the verge of catching pneumonia. So he has this near-death experience. Now we have to remember that it's both literal and figurative. Literally he has pneumonia and he's very close to his death here perhaps, but probably we're talking about a near-death experience more importantly, figuratively, right? Meaning that his soul or, you know, some important aspect of who he once was is close to death here, right? And near-death experience corresponds to his determination to see this woman and to think these lurid and lascivious thoughts about her, right? So after saying, oh, I might as well be a Greek and I will have all these women and all this, knowing that this is not what he wants for himself, we can see why a near-death experience would follow shortly after, okay? Now this, at the end of this story, Anderson gives us one of the most unexpected and beautiful images. And I say that from, you know, a literary buff background, and I'm that type of person, right? And I can respect when I'm given something that's not expected in a story, and now I have to sit here and make sense of it and analyze it and try to see, well, what's the intent of the author? Why would they put this in here? And that's what we get here at the end on page 91. After a frantic anticipation within this land of fantasy that Reverend Hartman has experienced, he sees her naked body. So this is almost like a culmination, right? He's been peeping. We were talking about the bare shoulders. We were talking about the white neck, right? And now it culminates, and here she is, and she's naked. And it would seem as if this is what he's been expecting all along, right? But it's not just a naked body. It is not a pretty or erotic or a seducing sight, because in her state of nakedness, she begins to pray on her bed. She is on her hands and knees, and she is, or not hands and knees, but on her knees, and she is praying naked on her bed. And what I love about this is, especially in our day and age, 2016, we think of a female nude body, and of course, you know, we start to get excited, right? Generally speaking. And we start to, you know, feel this sense of eroticism or sexuality. But all of those feelings go out the window completely when you think of a naked body praying, right? In the act of prayer. So all of that is essentially nullified and neutralized, and now we're focused in on the act of prayer. The naked body means nothing anymore. It is now just this act of prayer. It is mentioned that she takes on the exact image of the boy kneeling before Christ. So when we talk about that picture in the stained glass window of the boy kneeling before Christ, raptly, just kind of waiting for something, now she looks exactly like that boy. Now this is interesting, because here he had desire. He had this sexualized desire for her body as a woman. It has been totally desexualized, and now it has taken on the appearance or the form of a prepubescent boy, right? Flat chest. Now she looks more like a boy. So again, her body, her womanly body, which was the source of desire and sexual temptation, which caused all of these radical changes in Reverend Hartman, is now completely desexualized. And you got to be asking yourself, well, what is the effect of this? And I struggle with having precise, accurate analysis about this end, but let me just walk you through some of my ideas here. What are the effects of this appearance? I think we have to ask that question for a couple different people. What are the effects of this appearance for us as readers? What are the effects of this appearance for Reverend Hartman? And let me at least deal with Reverend Hartman. It obviously nullifies his desire and his understanding of Kate, as she is a woman who is seeking some atonement. There's the irony. He was worried about her sin of reading these books and kind of indulging in things that are not of God. And here we recognize that she's been struggling with issues and questions and some kind of need for God this whole time. So that's going to totally eradicate that idea that he had early on. Beyond that, it might reveal to him that he is the only sinner and the only one who has been tempted all along. This was never a question about Kate Swift and her particular sins and her potential for sin. This really was entirely, all along, a question of Reverend Hartman, as it should be, because he's the main character and essentially the protagonist of this particular short story. Again, it desexualizes her. The body, which was a source of temptation, is now a source of redemption, right? As she sits there waiting for some kind of message from Christ, just like the boy in the stained glass window, right? It is now a source of redemption, at least for her, quite simply. a naked body praying is not the body of erotic temptation, but rather there is something solemn and serene about this nakedness in the light of God. My question for you, because that's just my stab at it, and I think it's such a wonderfully abrupt, unexpected scene at the end of this short story, I could only give it my best shot with my analysis, right? But my question for you is, what is your analysis of this image and scene and its effect on Reverend Hartman? Most of these characters run and reveal, so that occurs, and then of course Hartman runs out and he's had this cathartic kind of life-changing experience, and which is what ends up happening in these stories is, for the most part, they always run and seek out George Willard. As you know, George Willard kind of appears in most of these stories. He is the town journalist. He's a very young man on the verge of manhood. We talked about manhood with hands, right? What it means to be a man. And so they always run out and they find George. So most of these characters run and reveal and share their cathartic moment with George Willard, the town reporter, who hopefully can garner a subjective understanding of their dilemma, hopefully. Remember, we started with hands. That was the last lecture, where the poet can deliver a subjective, more or less emotional, somewhat biased, and move beyond appearances understanding of these characters and the important things that are happening in their lives, and of course their conflicts, right? So hopefully George Willard, as an objective reporter, is becoming more subjective in then carrying these stories to a wider audience, which might be us as a readership here, right? You know, look at the appearances of this. On the surface, if all I think about is Reverend Hartman, and I have an objective sense of this, all I can see is he's a peeping Tom. What a weirdo. He's disgusting, right? He's a peeping Tom. And you can still think that, right, even after reading the story. But if you start to get into it subjectively, you understand there's more going on here, the real conflicts that he's dealing with here, especially as somebody who is trying to stay devoted to some cause, in this case, the cause of God, right? So it's much deeper than that, and we have to get subjective. Page 92. Bearing the message of truth. I'll just kind of make sure I understand where that is. He says, God has appeared to me. This is Hartman explaining his experience to George. God has appeared to me in the person of Kate Swift, the school teacher, kneeling naked on a bed. Do you know Kate Swift? Although she may not be aware of it, she is an instrument of God, bearing the message of truth. Now, like any good author, and especially Sherwood Anderson, who I think is incredibly talented, he's not going to tell us what that truth is. He said Kate Swift's body, naked on the bed, praying to God, is bearing the message of truth. And so we have to define truth. Sherwood Anderson is not going to do it for us. As a involved reader or an involved readership, we have to fill in the blanks, right? And one of my questions is, does her being a school teacher factor into truth in any kind of way? This truth that he discovers, though he does not explain, and we have to articulate, this truth delivers him from sin and evil. And here's the truth, I guess, that I can give my best shot. I can try to articulate it. The strength of God emboldens him to find strength excuse me, not just to replace the vulnerability that he had, but to restore, like the image of Kate as boy with Christ essentially does, the entire idea of needing God, the light of God, which is a very virtuous dependency, right? But again, you would have your own interpretation there. This was one of the most touching stories that I found. I thought it was well done. That's going to do it for this particular lecture. I feel like with this story, maybe I've presented more questions than answered, but as long as I'm pointing out some of the important issues, the important themes that are involved here, then hopefully I've done a good enough job. The next lecture, the last lecture of the entire course will be on death, which is a short story that comes later in this book. And thank you for watching, and have a beautiful evening.